Did you guys see when we read Parashat Shofatim? So we read about the commandment to appoint a Jewish king. The Rambam counts the mitzvahs, like many did. He says with regards to Amalek, there's three mitzvahs: the positive commandment to remember, and the positive commandment to destroy Amalek, and the negative commandment to forget. You shouldn't forget. Okay, very good. You could say that if we're already commanded to remember, so of course there's a negative to forget. And if we're told not to forget, of course we should remember. Yes, why is it that the Torah is very specific in some places? Okay, there's what to say. With regards to appointing a king, there is a commandment to appoint a king. And then the Torah says that the king has to be from among your brethren. It has to be Jewish. And then it says, Lo tuchala tetalecha ish nochri. And you should not place upon yourself a foreigner. Rambam puts just one commandment. He says there's a commandment to have a king, but he doesn't say, and there's a commandment to make sure the king is of Jewish stock. But he does say that there is a negative commandment that he be of kahal gerim, that is of convert stock. There's a certain condition, ad shetihye imo Yisrael, until his mother's of Jewish stock. That's a specifically defined category within the halachas of genealogy, yichusim. And how we define that is actually, there's too Talmudic nuance and dispute to it, but let's just say that someone whose parents themselves were converts, you could say, well, his mother's Jewish. That doesn't really work. She has to have come from Jewish stock somewhere along the way. The point is, you need someone of this caliber. And usually the prophets are supposed to pick someone who God chooses. So God's going to show them someone who has a nice Jewish pedigree. And of course, Kal v'chomer, it shouldn't be someone who is himself a convert or someone who's not even converted to Judaism. In the olden days, by the way, this happened. Nations have picked, we discussed before, sometimes they offer the throne to someone who's totally not of theirs. It seems that that's the way it was sometimes in Edom. That's what's implied in the Psukim in Genesis and in Chronicles. That's what Chazal says the meaning of what's described how Balak became the king of Moab. And that happened to, let's say, the current rulers of Norway. Back in the early 1900s, I pointed out to the guys, the Norway didn't have a king, so they offered their throne to a Danish prince. He's close enough. He's got all the right relations. So let's make him king. That happens. Yeah, maybe he's ethnically sort of similar to them, but still he's an Ish Nochri. So the Torah is addressing something here. It has to be someone who's Jewish. So what's going on? Now, we do not have Ta'amei HaMisvot. A lot of times the Torah does not tell us why. What's the reason for the commandments? And it's also dangerous for us to try to go beyond our own human capabilities and reasoning. Why? If you say, well, I can figure out the reason, or even the reason sometimes is explicit. The minority of mitzvahs, there's an explicit reason. It can make Shlomo Melech's mistake. He said, well, the reason doesn't apply to me, so I don't have to keep the commandment. And that led to his downfall. Solomon said that he's the wisest, and his taking of too many wives is not going to turn his heart astray. And that's what ended up happening. So sometimes, even if one knows knows the reason, he shouldn't then say, well, I know the reason, now I could start reasoning with the commandment. You have to keep the commandment first. You can understand the reason. The Rambam, in a few places, talks about trying to discern the reason for these commandments. And even if the Rambam himself offers reasons, it doesn't mean that they're not disputed. So we've talked about these issues. The Sefer HaChinuch, for example, tries to give his own roots of the commandment, not necessarily reasons, but he's talking about what's behind the commandment. And of course, those reflect his own understandings. Obviously, they're not undisputed. So there is much to say between the Rambam. We've discussed it in previous shiurim. You can go see them, find them on YouTube, where we discussed the Rambam's views about certain commandments. Fine. So the Chinuch gives a reason, he believes, for why this is a commandment. He says that the Jewish people need someone who is like them, one of theirs, who has the natural Jewish proclivities toward kindness, so that he can rule the people in a kind way. He could be tolerant of his people, nice to his people. That's why he'd want someone who's not even a convert. You want someone who's Jewish from the get-go. And they said, for example, the Gibeonites who had converted to Judaism in Joshua's generation, even a few hundred years later in King David's time, still did not have these classically Jewish traits. They were still cruel in nature. That's what the Chinuch says. But I have a kashi on that. One, unfortunately, the Torah doesn't say that. Secondly, we have seen a few times in history that this Jewish tendency to be compassionate has been used against us, and it doesn't really work out for good. The case of Ahab, who took too much compassion on Ben-Hadad, the Aramean or Aramite king, and that was a problem. and he let him go. And then the prophet chastised him and says, "You let him go this time, he'll come back and hurt you, and it'll be worse for the people. Your misplaced mercy will come back and harm you." And even today, we see that certain leaders of the Jewish people, let's say, just take our current prime minister and minister of defense, may God replace them speedily in our days, have basically shown more compassion for enemy civilians who have, for the most part, very much endorsed the murderers of our people and are closely related to the murderers of our people and serve as human shields often willingly for the murderers of our people. But still, the commanders of the IDF care more for them than they do for our soldiers. And it's even, it's on record through their actions, and also through Gantz. He should be retired soon and replaced by someone who has fear of God and not fear of the West in his heart. He's even declared very, very, very explicitly in clear English that he is willing and has done this willingly, put the lives of our soldiers at risk in order to subscribe to these high standards of Tohar HaNeshek, I guess, in other words, some sort of war ethic, this Christian-formed war ethic to which only Jews are held and which is basically suicidal. Protect the enemy civilians at the cost of your own troops. So that's ridiculous. They're misplaced mercy. So I would say that it's actually the opposite of what the Chinuch is saying. And notice, with regards to a king, there's only a negative commandment. Don't place this foreigner as your king. Why? Because the Jewish people need commandments to tell them what to do. If not, they wouldn't have done it. We've discussed before. God gave the commandment to reproduce. Why? Most people, they don't need to be told to be attracted to the opposite sex. They just go and do it. And it's been working for mankind quite well. But you would have some Jewish people would have reasoned that perhaps it's one can make himself holier by being celibate. This is a Jewish idea, by the way. And perhaps men like the Rambam or the Vilna Gaon would reason that that's the highest ideal to which a person can aspire. And therefore, God said, no, you have to. So a Talmud Chacham engages in the minimum necessary once a week. And same thing with eating the meat and drinking wine, because the Torah says so, and you're supposed to have a little enjoyment in your life, Oneg Shabbos, and that's why the Torah says it. So too, the Torah commanded us to make war. Why? Too many Jewish people across the ages would have reasoned it's better to be pacifist or to not fight back. There's too many things, it's against our nature, etc. So the Torah specifically says, you Jewish people have to know you have to fight wars sometimes, even though it's against your nature, and you have to win, and you have to be cruel to these cruel people in order to save yourselves. You have to fight Amalek. Now, the king's first role, first and foremost, is to fight Israel's wars. Israel, I'm talking about the Jewish people, the eternal Jewish people. God wants us to fight. That's how the Rambam calls it, the laws of kings and their wars. The Jewish king is meant to fight the wars. So the Jewish people would have thought, here's the Yetzer Hara, that whenever you have a thou shalt not, it's addressing the Yetzer Hara. There are certain Jews who would say, because making war is so difficult for us Jews, it requires a certain amount of cruelty and violence, better that perhaps we appoint someone who is perhaps a foreigner or a bunch of foreigners to run the military establishment and let them do it. It will be easier for them. Our friend Boris joked about this. They should have, or maybe it's not him. They'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. That it would be good if we had a chief of staff who is a Druze and the defense minister who is a Russian. There are many Russians here who are not Jewish. Why? Because they would have destroyed the enemy on day one, almost 2 weeks ago now. They would have just done it and be done with it, and everything would be good. It would be much easier for us to do that. Kamash Malan, the Torah gave us the commandment to hire one of our fellow Jews as king. And by the way, the Gemara continues, all the Swarot, the Sar Bitachon and the Sar Tzava, and the rest of the king's underlings who conduct the war for him. They're the ones who prosecute the war. So they're also supposed to be Jewish. The commandment is for us to do because you have a Yetzer Hara, hand it off to someone else to do. No, a Jew, just like you have a mitzvah to make war, despite your nature, you have a mitzvah to make sure that the people handling the war are also Jewish despite their natures and despite what you would rather do. And despite the fact that you think it could be done better by handing it off to people who are more cruel by nature. You know, that's what they do sometimes. When they have to, destroy Jewish yeshuvim, so they don't hire Jewish troops because they're just not going to do it. So they specifically do take people of non-Jewish stock to do that.